This is Haley Davis interviewing my grandmother, Jane Carson, on March 27th about the civil rights movement.
My name is Jane Carson. I'm Haley's grandmother. I am a baby boomer. My age is 64.
So, how did the civil rights movement in 1967 affect you personally? For example, was your school or community segregated?
My school was segregated. My community was segregated. I lived in Chicago housing project. My school, which was DuSable High School, a very proud black high school, was in the middle of the community in that it was surrounded by housing projects. Therefore, there were no whites that went to DuSable High School because there were no whites that lived in Chicago Housing Authority on the south side of Chicago. So yes, segregation was certainly prominent in those days.
So, there are people, obviously, that were involved in the civil rights movement, such as Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. What was your impression of those people? How did you view them?
I knew about Rosa Parks. I learned about her in school. Martin Luther King, I could almost watch him on TV every night. There was always a news report recording violence and the mishaps that happen in a lot of cities and oftentimes in Chicago. However, I was not part of that. I lived a sheltered life where I was not exposed to the riots. I was not exposed to any of the violence. The first time I was really encountered with, came in contact with racial violence was after I was much older. I came in contact with discrimination when I first got a real job, where white people got the best jobs. I was qualified for the jobs, but because I was black, I didn't get the job. I didn't get the same treatment as the white people, especially white women on a job. So, yes, discrimination. I was encountered with discrimination, but not in the 1967 time. It was much later.
Do you care to share any information about the discrimination that you experienced or people that you knew experienced?
It's kind of hard to put my finger on it right now, but it was pretty obvious that the special privileges, the promotions, the raise in salaries were given to whites as opposed to blacks. And in my case, I was fully capable of being promoted and getting a raise, and it was given to whites over me.
So I know you mentioned that you didn't participate in any marches or protests, but what were your opinion on those? Do you think they helped the movement, or what do you think about that?
I think that the protests were necessary. There was a lot of violent actions, and it was hard to look at. It was hard to look at blacks being beaten with billy clubs by Chicago police and in other cities. So because it was so violent, I was protected from that, in that my parents would not let my sisters and my brothers and myself watch those actions on the television. We had to shut off the television when the nightly news displayed the violent acts. So we were, in essence, sheltered from the violence.
So even 90 years later, in today's day and age, do you think the kind of discrimination and segregation that existed then still exists now?
I certainly think it still exists. I think it is not as obvious, but yes, it still exists. I think it exists, especially in the Chicago public schools. I think it exists in the workplace, where at this date and time, the better jobs are still given to the whites. As far as the education system is concerned, the education for black schools, the education is substandard. It does not prepare the black students to go out and seek and gain the better jobs. And so therefore, the employment discrimination turns out to be justified in that the black students are not prepared for the jobs because they are undereducated. So, yes, the two societies still remain.
Do you have any stories of experiences that you've had in the past based on the racial discrimination in the workplace that you have experienced that you mentioned repeatedly throughout this interview?
When I mentioned that my first encounter with racism was when I first got a real job. I was a new mother with a sick child. My daughter was sick, and I couldn't get a babysitter to look after a sick child, so I was absent from work a lot. However, I had a very good friend who was also absent a lot. A very good white friend. Came from a prominent family. They owned a trucking company. Her absenteeism record was comparable to mine, but she didn't have a sick child. She was absent a lot. So I was approached by my manager and asked that I sign a contract saying that I agreed to termination the very next time I was absent. And I disagreed with that. I couldn't sign that because I had a sick child. So he said, okay, well, the very next time you're absent, then we will terminate you. You're not giving us any other choice to consider the fact that you have a sick child. But I didn't want to agree to signing anything like that because I know I would not be able to live up to it. So I was absent on a weekend. And when I came back to work on Monday, I was terminated. The very good friend that I talked about was also absent that weekend and didn't show up to work on Monday. So when I was told that I would be terminated, I said, okay, I don't have any I can't protest that, but I just know that I better not go by myself. And the manager said, don't worry, you won't be by yourself. I said that to say that I know of a person who has the same kind of record that I have, and if you're going to terminate me, then you have to terminate her. And I knew full well they wouldn't terminate her because she was white and her parents were rich. My manager knew that. Well, as it turned out, she was not the person that I said. When I mentioned that I better not go by myself, I assumed they would consider her, but they didn't. they fired another black male employee. So when I went to go for unemployment, unemployment told me that I would have to go to some other agencies first to protest the firing. The agencies was an affirmative action agency and EEOC. So when I went to EEOC, they told me that I could prove discrimination if I could find a white person who had a record comparable to mine. And it was very easy to find a white person with a record comparable to mine. And I named that person. Well, when it was investigated, the records had been altered. And the records had been altered by the Human Resource Department. And it showed that this person did not have a record comparable to mine. So the termination stood. The whole story is I was trying to say that it was a racial situation in that they fired me and didn't fire her when we had the same kind of absenteeism record.
Okay, so you mentioned that story. Were there any other stories of racism that you experienced in the workplace?
Okay, so I had another good friend who was a communist. And he let me in on a lot of communist views. And some of it I agreed to and some of it I didn't agree to. The thing that I did not want to have to do was the May Day rallies. They used to have May Day rallies, okay? The thing that I liked a lot about the communists is they were anti-racism. They would protest all kinds of racist, rallies. Okay, so I used to help him by handing out flyers. And the flyers used to talk about the May Day rallies and the protest against racism. And probably the only part that I liked and understand about communism was that they were anti-racist. So because I was seen with him all the time, him and his wife, I was on the verge of losing a job by just associating with this individual. His wife was pregnant. He worked on a day shift and I worked on a day shift. In fact, he would pick me up and he would give me a ride to work. And his wife worked also in the daytime at another facility. But at night he needed to be home with her. So they asked him to stop with this assembly and passing out the flyers. Told him it was illegal. He couldn't do it on hospital property. He researched and found out that it wasn't hospital property. So he was justified in standing out, passing out the flyers. So my boss came to me one day and asked me if I was a communist. And I said, no, I agree with some of their teachings and what they stand for, but no, I'm not a communist. And so he said, then how come you hang around MC? Those are his initials. And I said, I can hang around who I want to hang around. And he said, unfortunately, in this day and age, you can't hang around who you want to hang around. Because you're judged by the company you keep. And so I said, explain that to me. And he said, you're not an idiot. You know what I'm talking about. And I said, no, I'm not an idiot. And don't try and make me an idiot. And don't bring this up to me again. So then he went to MC and told MC, if you don't stop assembling outside the hospital and passing out the flyers, we will eliminate your job. And so he said, okay, but you got to be justified in doing that. So they realized they couldn't eliminate his job. So what they did was they took him from the day shift and made him work at nights. And his wife was going to have a baby any day now. So he found that to be, directly related to the fact that he was a communist and he was handing out flyers for people to read. So he asked me if I would speak in his behalf at a grievance. And in the grievance, he was going to have an attorney, his own attorney. And so I said, yeah, I'll do that. I'll speak in your behalf. I mean, because it was obvious that they put him on. Because he made all of these arrangements to work on days and be at home at night. He went through a lot to arrange that. So when I said to my boss, I didn't want to be on a certain team on this particular day, and the reason I chose that, the reason I said that was because I know that was the day that I had to speak at his hearing. So they figured it out. And they made it impossible for me to be at the hearing. They fixed it so I was on this special team at work where I couldn't leave the workplace. The hearing was going to be in another building, meant I would be out of the hospital and someplace else. So when they got wind of it, because I think we had to let them know that there was a grievance hearing going on, and so they knew that I would speak, and they knew that I was outspoken, and I wasn't scared to say what I had to say, and that I'd be speaking in his behalf. So they arranged it so I could not be at the hearing. Anyway, MC ended up, he lost the grievance. He lost that battle. He ended up having to work nights. His wife ended up having to go to the hospital via the ambulance. And sooner or later, because of the sake of his child, his new baby, he ended up quitting. But it was obvious racism. So when I say I was encountered with racism later in life, that's what I mean. I wasn't encountered with racism as a teenager growing up.
Well, thank you for opening up and giving me these two stories to use for my interview.
You're welcome.